Ned, I'm going ahead and I've pressed record on this. I'm going to turn it over to you, and then you can turn it right over to Eric Anderson.
Will do.
Thanks.
This is Ned Grossnickel. I'm the current president of the Aldo Leopold Audubon Society, and I'd like to welcome you to our third program of the 2020-2022-21 season. The first two programs have been very well received and successful, and I'm sure that tonight's will be as well. Our Vice President, Eric Anderson, will introduce tonight's speaker. I'd like to now pass it over to Eric.
Excellent. Thank you, Ned, very much. If I were to ask you what turkeys and wolves have in common, you might pause for a minute waiting for the punchline to a joke, but it's a serious question. One's a mammal, the other one's a bird. One's a carnivore and the other one is an herbivore. One can obviously fly, and quite clearly wolves are pretty terrestrial in nature. So what do these two Wisconsin species have in common that not many other wildlife species in the state can claim? Give up? They're both species that completely disappeared from the state and have only made their comeback into our region in the last 40 years. Well, with Thanksgiving just around the corner, we're extremely fortunate to have Chris Parmentier from the Wisconsin DNR with us this evening to tell us about the ecology, history, and the management of the bird in the state of Wisconsin, including a few common myths about turkeys. Chris is an upland game bird research scientist with the DNR. He got his bachelor's degree at La Crosse and his master's from UW-Madison, and has been researching turkeys for nearly 10 years now with the DNR. He's worked also in the past on mercury contamination in common loons in northern Wisconsin and the effects of PCBs on spotted sandpipers, belted kingfishers, and tree swallows in upstate New York. Now, he devotes most all of his time to studying turkeys and ruffed grouse in the state. Chris currently lives in Cottage Grove with his wife and two boys. Chris will be available at the end of this presentation to take any questions that you may have. So hang on until that point and we'll try to do the chat questioning and perhaps some live interaction if there's an opportunity for that. So Chris, I turn it over to you.
Well, thank you, Eric. And thank you for the invite to give a talk on turkeys. And for those that will be seeing this, thank you very much for joining in. So my name is Chris Parmentier. I am an upland game bird research scientist for Wisconsin DNR. I'm based out of Madison. Actually work in the Office of Applied Science, so that's sort of our research arm with the DNR, and do a lot of work side by side with folks in wildlife management and consulting and folks with the university system and so on. So I said today I wanted to sort of share a brief history of turkeys actually in the state of Wisconsin, and just sort of a lighthearted, not too in-depth, just sort of overview on the general background and history of turkeys in the state, all the way from sort of the pre-extirpation and how we came about actually reintroducing the bird and restoring populations within the state, and then sort of end on just giving a really brief sort of overview and hitting some of the main bullet points on some of the recent research that we've done here in the state and some of our management issues and concerns. So with that, we'll just sort of jump right in. So turkeys are the largest member of the game bird family of galliforms. So they're in with all the grouse and partridge and pheasants and so on. So there's actually 5 subspecies that we have here in North America. All are native to North America and the US, but they all inhabit some very different habitats in different areas of the country. So here in Wisconsin, we have easterns, and as the name may apply, really the eastern subspecies is found throughout the entirety of eastern United States. And then there's some of the other subspecies in the southern and western United States, the Rios and Miriams, and so on. There's actually another species of turkey, the ocellated turkey, that is found down in the Yucatan, but they're not directly related to the turkeys that we think of here in the U.S. But so you can sort of see the overall distribution here, and really they're found in just about every single state across the U.S. So like I had mentioned at the outset, turkeys are native to North America. So that sort of brings up the question, why do we call them turkey? And what does it have to do with this critter, the guinea fowl? So here's your brief history lesson for the day. So Turkey, the country of Turkey, was once the former center of the Ottoman Empire. And at that time, the guinea fowl, they're native to Eastern Africa, were imported to Europe through the country of Turkey. And then, so therefore, they became known as turkey cock for the males and turkey hens for the females. So fast forward to when the New World settlers and explorers came to the U.S., they had written back in their logs that they were finding these guinea and peafowl type birds. So what they ended up doing was just simply calling them turkeys in reference to the guinea fowl that were being imported through Europe, through Turkey and into Europe. So the name just sort of stuck, and now we have wild turkey. So just sort of a real brief list of fun facts for you. So the scientific name of turkey, Meliadrus galapagos-silvestris, actually, when you break it down, means guinea or peafowl of the forest. So it's a very, very adequate name for them. It's a fairly old species. The oldest fossil of the modern turkey, if you will, is we're guessing about 2 million years old. Toms, so the males, are approximately twice the size of females. Their lifespan, is anywhere from 2 to 5 years. 5 years gets to be a pretty old bird. I'd say that 2 to 3 or 4 year range is probably much more common. One myth that I can dispel for you here. So spur length and beard length has nothing to do with age. All that it means is that you have a turkey that has long spurs or a turkey with a long beard. There's no correlation whatsoever there. So I apologize for all you hunters that, harvest a turkey with a 2-inch long spur and think you have an old beard or an old tom. These birds have a very large sort of vocabulary, if you will. There's at least 28 different and distinct vocalizations that we know of. So these are all the putts and the kiki calls and clucks and so on, aside from the typical gobbling that we associate them with. And that gobbling, by the way, can be heard from quite a distance. It's when you have a bird that is in the roost and really high up on a tree, especially if they're, on the hillside over a valley, it's very easy to hear them from at least a mile, if not a mile and a half away. So fairly long distance. Of course, they have fantastic eyesight, which is why we're always in a blind or in camo when we go out and hunt them. And there are multiple colorations. I actually just got an email on this today about some folks that were seeing these smoke gray phased turkeys. And this, what it actually ends up being is just a recessive trait in the genes. And so sometimes we get these, well, we call them gray or smoke phased, which are more of a white with some black on the wings and tail tips. But you can also get some red phased and some melanistic phased birds that are really dark as well. Again, all wild turkeys, just slightly different color variations. So one last sort of fun little tidbit here. So some folks may have heard sort of the myth of Ben Franklin wanting the turkey to be sort of on the Great Seal, or sort of our national symbol. And I hate to be the downer, but Ben Franklin actually, that is truly a myth. But of course, where that there is a little bit of truth in some of that. So just a really quick background. When the country was first founded, of course, there was a SEAL committee that was put together. Ben Franklin was on that, and they were trying to come up with what we think of as the presidential symbol, with the bald eagle on the seal. But they had many different ideas. A lot of them were like from the book of Exodus. But ultimately, none of these, they couldn't reach an agreement on any of these. But I can say that turkey was definitely not considered. And over the years, or a few years later, there was a couple more of these committees that were put together. And eventually they had come up with a symbol, but it was the imperial eagle of Europe. Well, of course, at that time, we were trying to distance ourselves from the UK and from Europe and as a whole. So eventually we changed that to a bald eagle. So where turkey actually comes in here is Ben Franklin had written a letter to his daughter in 1784, and he is actually critiquing the Society of Cincinnati, which is an association of Continental Army vets. And they have produced an emblem or a medal that looked much more like a turkey than an eagle. So, Ben Franklin was really critical of that. And he actually exclaimed that, the bald eagle was a bird of bad moral character and doesn't give its living honestly. And his point was that, in hindsight, the turkey is a much more respectable bird. So, but needless to say, so we still have the bald eagle, and that's kind of where this whole myth of Ben Franklin wanting the turkey to be our national symbol comes from. So, a myth that'll live in lore, but needless to say, it makes for a really good story. So what about for Wisconsin and the history of the bird in this state? Well, there's actually a really good paper by Arlie Shorter in the Wilson Bulletin back in 1942 that he gives a very detailed account of turkeys in the state. And some of the earliest records that we have are from turkeys being near Lake Winnebago in 1670. And as I'm sure a lot of us know, look, turkeys were an extremely valuable resource for the Native Americans and for early settlers. They provided food. Feathers could be used for all sorts of different headdresses or clothing and so on. And, there was market hunting that was going on, and turkeys back then sold for as little as a quarter a piece in Lancaster back in the mid 1850s. So again, this is one of the figures from Shorter's paper, and each one of these dots represents a confirmed sighting of turkeys. So, we certainly had turkeys that occupied the southern half or sort of the southeastern half of the state, basically from a line from Prairie du Chien all the way up to Green Bay. But as is the case with a whole lot of our species, it was really this unrestricted hunting and habitat destruction that ultimately led to their extirpation, and to the point where, in 1881 was our last known record of turkeys in the state. And so we went for a number of years without there being turkeys in Wisconsin, to the point where Shorter, even in the last paragraph of this paper that I keep referencing, he comes out and even says that it's doubtful that if a planting will ever become successful in Wisconsin. It becomes so bleak. And, he makes the case that, because of all this overhunting that have been going on, that even if there were birds, or the possibility of having birds, there's this line, the very last line, that there are no longer reserves to the southward. So what he is referring to is birds in Illinois. And the thinking is that, when we had hard winters here in Wisconsin, that, perhaps our population of turkeys was sort of assisted, if you will, or there was birds that would come up from Illinois to sort of replenish our population. And it got so bleak that we didn't even think that that was possible. So we went for a number of years without thinking that there were turkeys, but that's not to say that there weren't a whole bunch of attempts to restock them. So even in the late 1880s, there were private individuals that were trying to release birds so that we could have turkeys. The one that's most commonly referenced is the two pair that were released near Lake Koshkonong. And even the state itself, through our game farm program, we tried to release birds, almost 3,000 birds in Sauk and Grant counties. And that actually had a little bit of success, to the point where we actually had a short season on turkeys. So this is a turkey tag from 1938 and 39, allowing this, and I apologize, I can't quite make out the name, but allowing this individual the ability to go out and harvest turkeys. So I took a little bit of liberty and used the back of this tag, and I tried to outline approximately what the zones were. So this would have been sort of south of Wisconsin Dells, and basically in the either side of the Baraboo area, that we had a small sort of hunting zone for turkeys. And then, needless to say, birds eventually, we had over harvested them again. And we had tried a number of times, going throughout the 50s and 60s to reintroduce birds. We tried bringing in some game farm birds from Pennsylvania and release them into Meadow Valley. Even the U.S. Forest Service got involved a little bit in trying to relocate birds in Oconto County. But again, all of these attempts, that's the one common thread. They were all unsuccessful. And it really got people thinking, hey, maybe Shorter's sort of the cynical outlook may be warranted. Maybe it truly is that we can't have, or that we won't have turkeys here. But the one thing that's common throughout all these is that we were using pen-reared game farm turkeys. None of these turkeys were wild or had any inherent wildness to them. So they just didn't have any survival skills to them. So, and it's not just here in Wisconsin, it was really throughout many of the states who were trying to reintroduce turkeys. And thought was, maybe we should turn to some wild trap birds. And with the advent of rocket netting and cannon nets, that allowed us to be able to trap turkeys. So Wisconsin had partnered with Missouri Department of Conservation, and they had supplied us turkeys starting in the mid-1970s. And in exchange, we had sent them rough grouse. And, the argument could be made, now we have an issue with rough grouse in the state, but so we blame Missouri. But so we actually, there was an exchange rate. So it was 3 rough grouse for 1 turkey. So we eventually sent almost 1,000 rough grouse to Missouri. In exchange, we had 334 turkeys that came from Missouri over the course of 9 years that we had released throughout the entire, throughout Southwest Wisconsin. So each one of these yellow shaded counties had received turkeys from Missouri. The very first release was in the Bad Axe region or watershed of Vernon County, so in far western Vernon County. And the program that we had became so successful that we were actually able to retrap some of these birds after a period of time and relocate them throughout the entire state, to the point where we had moved almost 4,000 turkeys throughout 50 plus counties in the state. And move ahead to today, we now have turkeys, a sustainable turkey population in every single county, all 72 counties within the state. So it is a true wildlife success story, in that we went from absolutely nothing to, now we have birds that are beyond their native range. We also had some help from our neighbors in Minnesota, Michigan, and Iowa. Those birds saw greener pastures across the river and flew over. They helped supplement our population here. And it became so well that we actually paid it forward, and we helped folks in Kansas, Kentucky, and South Carolina with their reintroduction programs. And we had worked out a deal with them, to send some of our Wisconsin birds to help them replenish their populations. In exchange, we got funds to help do turkey management here in Wisconsin. So, of course, this leads, things were going so well that we reintroduced harvest seasons. And so we have two seasons, one in the spring, one in the fall. And really what it comes down to, the main goal of turkey hunting is, one, to reduce the risk of overharvest. And really we want to maintain a healthy game population now that, we've spent all this time and money and effort in order to reintroduce these birds. And the second part is also to maximize these quality recreational opportunities for hunters, but not just for hunters, for bird watchers and outdoors people alike, to enjoy the resource. And as you may expect, as we reintroduce birds throughout the state, of course, we slowly created more management zones throughout the state. And to the point where in 2006 here, we finally had harvest zones throughout the entire state. So it took a good 20 plus years in order to do this. Once we had all these zones, it's like, hey, we have just a whole hodgepodge of zones here and sort of this puzzle, if you will. And within some of these zones, we had subzones. So we had zone 1A, B, C, we had Fort McCoy zone. It just got to be a whole cluster and a mess and sort of hard to keep track of. So what we did in 2008 is we eventually consolidated these zones into 7 large turkey management zones. And the goal behind this was really just to expand hunting opportunities for folks, so that they weren't confined to one zone. But we had kept the 2 harvest season structure with this. And this is the season structure that we still have today. Harvest, of course, was almost on exponential growth, if you will, as the birds were reintroduced. And we reached a peak in 2007, 8, 9 area, and we've fallen back a little bit. But, I can sit here fairly comfortably and say, I'm really happy with where we are sitting at with, spring harvest being, in that 40,000 bird range. And, we've kept spring authorizations, right around that 200 to 215, 220,000 sort of area. So it's been fairly consistent for us. Fall harvest is a little bit of a different animal. We reached a peak in the mid 2000s and we've fallen off as far as the total harvest in the fall. But our fall authorizations have for the most part, stayed fairly consistent. We're 60, 70,000 or so fall authorizations for turkey hunting. But to be truthful, we're not, at least I'm not overly concerned or as concerned with the fall harvest. I mean, there's so many different things going on in the fall where our thinking is that people probably consider it more of an opportunistic event. There's deer hunting that's going on and so many other things that I don't know how. I mean, there's certainly some folks that are out there and that's their primary reason for being out in the field, fall turkey hunting, and certainly different experience. But I really think that, this is more of an opportunistic event more so than anything else. Of course, I'm not going to go through all this, but the point here with this little figure is just to say that, our turkey management program is not static at all. We've made a number of changes, and hopefully it's been for the better throughout the years. And, as issues come up, we certainly address those and we try to make changes as we see needed. So that's just a really quick sort of overview of the management program. And I want to take sort of the last part of the talk here and at least give you a little bit of a rundown of research in Wisconsin, especially research that we've done recently. And we've done a lot. And we've had a lot of manuscripts and a lot of talks and conferences sort of come out of that. And I truly feel that we are looked to as being one of the leaders in turkey research and management throughout the country. I have many conversations with a lot of my colleagues in the Southeast and really throughout the country, and they truly do look to us as sort of the leader, if you will, in turkey management and research in the country. And it really all started with these first research projects from Neil Paisley and Bob Wright and Robert Rowley, and there's a whole bunch of names I'm completely blanking on, but they really set the foundation and framework when we first reintroduced birds back in the late 80s and early 90s, and that was our framework for our first turkey management program. And what we really learned there was we learned the basic biology of the bird. So, for example, about half of the birds survive in any given year. And for different reasons, though. For hens, it comes down to predation, especially in the spring time of the year when they're nesting and brood rearing and they're on the ground and they're really vulnerable to risk of mortality. As far as the males, it all comes down to harvest. A lot of it, especially in that springtime, that's the biggest risk for them. And as far as some of the reproduction stuff, so the vast majority of hens and females nest, adults more so than juveniles. They will attempt to renest. We've had radio marked birds that will renest a third time if necessary. Nesting success is fairly low, so about a quarter of them actually hatch off a nest. Clutch sizes are anywhere 10 to 12 eggs. Takes about a month for them to incubate. About half of the poults actually survive their first month. So again, we have a whole bunch of eggs and a whole bunch of poults that are out in the landscape, and then it's really only a handful of birds that actually end up surviving into the fall and into the winter. So from that initial research, after we had done all these reintroductions, now sort of came the hard part. We have birds now throughout the entire state, so we entered this phase of, this post-restoration sort of research is what I like to call it. So really the questions were, how do landscapes influence turkey abundance and distribution? What what factors actually drive population dynamics. And ultimately, we're trying to get at how do we best manage an established population of turkeys. And we couldn't really look to past research because, heck, even as early as, or as recent as 1960s, it was thought that, it all boils down to winter severity and that what the one thing that turkeys need is forest cover, and that equated to suitable habitat. Well, we're in the agricultural portions of the upper Midwest, and we have a whole bunch of corn and soybeans and wheat and oats and stuff out on the landscape, let alone these, forested areas. So, back then, even at the first National Wild Turkey Symposium, this fellow, last name is Shaw, said, a wild turkey needs one thing for sure, and that's lots of timberland and not much human disturbance. And, my gosh, 25,000 acres of mature forest, holy smokes. Where do we have patches big enough, to manage that? So, we set on sort of this journey, if you will, to really try to evaluate how landscapes influence turkeys in the state. So, this all started with some graduate work that I was fortunately able to be involved with. And we had turned an eye again to where we knew that we had sort of our best populations, and that's in southwest and west central Wisconsin. And we had done some of these gobbling call count surveys, and what had came out of this was really almost this. It was almost a relationship that was too ideal. We became sort of wedded to this, but what popped out time and time again was this idea that our abundance estimates were highest in these landscapes that were almost an even mix of forest and open sort of agricultural habitat. And we saw it sort of year in and year out. And it wasn't just with our surveys that we were doing. We had radio marked birds out on the landscape, and we were seeing this even with our radio marked birds in townships. Forgive me, I forget which township this is. I think it's in Jackson County, but those birds were clearly moving into areas. If you were to put a home range around all those locations into an area that's roughly an even mix of this forest and open habitat, and even individuals, birds, like on the right-hand side here, their home range was almost an equal mix of this forest and open habitat. And it really didn't matter what it was. It didn't matter if it was an coniferous forest or an oak forest or maple forest. It just simply had to be forest. And the same thing on the sort of the open landscape side of it. What we were finding out is that, even when we were trying to tease these apart, it didn't really matter what it was. It didn't matter if it was a cornfield. It didn't matter if it was a CRP field. It just had to be open. And so that's what we're just sort of finding, was these broad, generalistic habitat categories. It wasn't just for the males either. It was also for the hens. So this is clearly all the green shaded here is all forest, and all the yellow shaded is all open habitat. And we're seeing birds that were really moving into these areas and really focused in on these areas that were sort of evenly mixed forest and open habitat. And that's not to say that you don't get a handful of birds that are, deep in the forest, and it takes you practically have to bushwhack in order to get back to them. Certainly there are those individuals, but again, we're seeing these trends and these associations sort of pop out. It wasn't only where the birds were going. We also saw this with survival curves. So, for example, here's hen survival, annual survival for a couple of different years. And again, if you take it on the whole, annual survival is approximately 50% or so. But when you tease these out a little bit, survival in these more open, mixed landscapes was considerably higher than in landscapes that were predominantly forested. So this was really eye-opening. We have birds, the general thinking is that, birds are just ubiquitous across the landscape. Well, let's take a little bit closer look here. There's definitely some trends that are going on here. If we have survival curves, like in this case, that are considerably higher in other landscapes than what they are in some other ones. So, and what's really fascinating is if you really take a look at this, the differences come, at least for the hens, in the nesting and brood rearing period. There's a stark decline in survival, during that spring when hens are nesting and they're brood rearing and they're very vulnerable. So of course, that sort of leads us to, what's going on. Well, what we found was that predator-related mortality was considerably higher during the spring in those forested landscapes. And likewise, the same goes with nest failure. We were finding nests, we were attributing nest failure to these mammalian predators. So, that was, I like to think it was good research, and that leads to, as all good research does, it leads to a lot more questions than what it does answers. So it was sort of clear to us that there are certainly ecological and demographic variability between landscapes, and that brings about the question of do we have a stable population? If we have a stable population, do those various vital rate metrics, could they possibly manifest in a population model? And which one of those rates actually drive population growth? So we had set out to answer those questions with a whole bunch of scary looking math and equations, and to the point where it just sort of makes you, sort of fall over and you don't know what, sort of every college student's worst nightmare is having to do calculus and comes to fruition. So, so we trudged forward and we had done some population modeling. We have this really robust and just great data set from, all this work that we had done over the past 4, 5, 6 years. And so it lent itself really well to a population model. So we did that, and lo and behold, we see that these population growth curves actually are a little bit depressed, if you will, in these forested landscapes, but their population growth is actually pretty high when you get into these mixed sort of open agricultural landscapes that have a little bit of forest in with them. When you sort of combine it all together, our population is pretty stable. I know the point estimate there that's on the screen, that 0.942, would suggest that's a little low. Again, you could tease this apart, 10 ways to Sunday. I really look at sort of that confidence interval, and I really think that we have a fairly stable population when you take a look at it as a whole. But that's not to say where you can't have landscapes where it's clearly evident that we possibly do have a population that's decreasing in some areas of the state and increasing in other areas, and they probably help. I'm sure that there's immigration and colonization and so on that's helping some of these landscapes that are near each other. Birds are certainly moving on the landscape. We had done some sensitivity analyses to find out what really drives population growth, and it really appears, and this isn't just for turkeys. I mean, we see actually similar phenomenon in a number of other game birds, ruffed grouse and prairie chickens and so on, where nesting survival and poult survival appears to really be driving the population. That's not to say that survival of adults and yearlings doesn't. It certainly does. But I think when it really comes down to it, it's hey, if we can find a way to get maximum number of poults and chicks out on the landscape, that will really drive and sort of increase our population. So we had taken this data and we had just run a really quick simulation to see, how much does poult survival or harvest influence population growth. And so there's sort of a lot going on here. At the end of the day, what we had found was that if you were to decrease harvest, that it certainly does increase population growth by a little bit. But really your biggest bang for the buck is if you can increase your reproductive output or just fecundity by 1 poult per hen, that gives you almost a 20% increase in lambda, your lambda curves. So it appears that it's, if we really want to sort of make sure that we have a stable population going in the future, then we ought to make sure that we are managing the landscape in order to help the most vulnerable period, which appears to be this nesting and reproduction phase. So that's just sort of in a nutshell, just a quick sort of overview. Certainly, there are distinct patterns in distribution and abundance of turkeys throughout the state. Roughly it's this equal parts of forest and open cover, and it doesn't really appear to be the individual cover type doesn't appear to be as important, but much more so, just is it open or is it forested cover? That appears to be the most important. We think we have a fairly stable population. That, of course, varies across the state and depending on what scale you want to look at. And it really does sort of boil down to, we think that poult production has the greatest impact on population growth. So those are sort of the quick bullet points from some of the initial research that we had done. I want to take just a couple more minutes here, and there's really 2 other projects I just want to highlight at the very least. And what I've talked about up to this point, all of our research has really been from that southwest portion of the state. Well, what about the rest of the state? There's certainly turkeys throughout those parts of the state as well. So we set out on a couple of different occupancy survey projects, and we had all these different survey routes throughout this different portion of the state. And we had done over 3,000 surveys for turkeys over a 4 or 5 year period. And we had, again, put some fancy math to it. And but we had also looked at landscapes, and we had looked at a whole bunch of different metrics and land cover metrics and to try to sort of tie this all together and what really drives sort of occupancy in these different parts of the state. And we also did this within these multi-season models because, for example, this is just an example of one survey route, but you can see, and as you expect, the landscape is very dynamic and it changes on an annual basis. And, corn fields, maybe corn one year and soybeans the next year, and wheat the following year, so on. So we had included those kind of metrics into our model sets. And not only that, but especially for northern Wisconsin, because the conventional wisdom was that winter severity may play a role in whether or not turkeys can occupy a landscape. We thought, well, we ought to do ourselves a favor and consider winter. So we did that, and we didn't. What we looked at was snow depth, because believe it or not, turkeys are able to withstand some really cold temperatures. So there's been some work out of Minnesota where they actually put birds in freezers, live birds, and measured metabolic rate, and they are able to easily withstand temperatures of 50 below zero. So what we really think is that it's snow cover that sort of drives where birds are out in the landscape. So it just so happens that the first year that we started, the winter of 2013-14 was one of the worst winters in recent memory that we've had, and that was it was really cold and really snowy that winter doing the surveys, but we still had birds on the landscape. So we had done this for each of the 4 years that we were up there. You can see there. And I'll spare you the fancy math and everything that's behind all these models, and just sort of hit the main points here. And what we were finding, again, at least in northern Wisconsin, was that, again, we have this really forested landscape. And what was most important up there was if we had just a little bit of open cover, we seemed to find birds, or they were at least occupying those areas. So one of the objectives here was to create these new range maps. So we were able to do that. And as you can see, I think it's fairly safe to say that, at least with these occupancy models, that turkeys are not ubiquitous throughout the landscape. I mean, you can certainly see, you get these really heavily forested areas, especially like in Forest County and Iron and Ashland counties. These oranges are really showing these really heavily forested areas. It's not that birds aren't there; they certainly are. Just the probability of occupancy isn't as high. But on the flip side, when you get into Barren County like this, these spots here, it's almost like you're in Rock County, heavily agricultural areas, and there just isn't the forest cover there for the birds to roost in. So what about southeast Wisconsin? Again, totally different landscape, highly agricultural, very little tree cover. And what we're finding is that as you increase the amount of agriculture on the landscape, the likelihood of turkeys occupying those patches decreases pretty significantly. So really, on the flip side, interspersion of hardwood forest, didn't really matter if it was what forest, as long as it was sort of upland hardwoods. If you have even a little bit of hardwood out on the landscape, that provided cover for those birds, and they were able to roost in those areas. So again, sort of the same thing here. And as you can see, Milwaukee sticks out like a sore thumb. But what I really sort of draw your attention to is when you start looking through the kettles, you get in Walworth County and Waukesha County in the kettles, you have a really nice mix of forested area in those landscapes along with sort of this open agricultural area. So again, turkey's not ubiquitous out on the landscape, but so we can sort of create these thunderstorm maps and models that we can use for management. And so this sort of leads me back to Shaw's comment that the one thing that a turkey needs is timberland and not much human disturbance. And I feel fairly confident in saying that we can actually cross that out. And it's not that they don't need forest, but they need lots of other habitat for sure. They're a generalist species. They certainly are not a specialist by any means. The last sort of one thing I want to touch on is a project that we have going on right now. We're actually working with Dr. Jason Riddle at UW-Stevens Point and one of his graduate students, and you may have remembered me alluding to how we think that productivity and recruitment is really driving populations. So we are taking a little bit of closer look at that, and this actually stems from another issue isn't the right word, but something else that we have going on in that. So we have, for the DNR, we have these 10-week brood surveys that we do in the late summer, where we, field staff record observations of turkeys and ruffed grouse and pheasants and gray partridge that they see. And as you expect, for turkeys anyway, we've seen this growth with the number of turkeys that we have on the landscape. And we, over the last 10 years or so, approximately 3.4 broods per observer, which is really good. I've shared some of this data with folks from Missouri, and they are envious. So Missouri, as an example, on the flip side, their recent brood observations are less than 1 poult per hen, and they are extremely concerned with what's going on with their population. So they I've been in touch with, folks down in Missouri, trying to help them sort of address and think about, what may be going on with their population there. And it's not just there. Folks in the Southeast have also become really concerned with their productivity levels as well. Back to Wisconsin here, the one thing that we're concerned about is with this survey, we've had a dramatic decline in the number of surveys that are submitted back to us. So Brian Dewey, I'm sure some of the folks are familiar with Brian and what he does with us through the DNR. Brian oversees a lot of our surveys actually, and it has reached a point where we are, quite frankly, no longer confident in some of the results that we're getting from our 10-week brood surveys. The graph there just shows, back in the 70s, we were up over 600 observations that were being submitted to us, and this past year, we were right around 200 surveys that were submitted. So we're really concerned about the robustness and the power of that data set. So what we've done is we've reached out to folks at Stevens Point, and we're actually working with Jen Stenglein, who's another research scientist, a colleague of mine. I'm sure you're familiar with the Snapshot Wisconsin program. So we're sort of piggybacking on Snapshot Wisconsin, and we're trying to see if we can use the trail cameras that we have throughout the entire state. And, they have over 2,000 trail cameras throughout the entire state. Each one of these orange blocks are survey blocks, along with some of the elk grids where they have a more concentrated number of survey cameras. They have over 50 million photos that they've collected so far. And obviously hundreds of thousands of pictures of turkeys that we thought that, maybe this is an opportunity for us to use that. So graduate student Hannah, who's in Dr. Reel's lab, herself and I and Jen Stenglein, actually Jen really created this program in R that Hannah is using to go through and count turkeys. And, the goal is to one, we're trying to evaluate the efficacy of using this. And then we're pretty sure it'll work, but from that, then we can hopefully obtain sex ratios and brood counts and poult to hen ratios and all these other metrics that we use to help us manage turkeys. And Hannah, to her credit, has, she's gone through, I have 93,000 plus triggers on there, and I'm certain that it's a lot more than that. And each one of those triggers is 3 photos. So that's over 270,000 photos that she's worked from. So bless her heart for sitting behind a computer and going through all this. But our hope is that, this is something that's really applied and will be very, very useful for us as we manage turkeys going into the future. So just one couple more slides to sort of wrap up here. So what's sort of looking ahead, obviously we're still, we're really interested in that Snapshot Wisconsin project. As I had mentioned before, there are some concerns with productivity and recruitment. There's a lot of questions behind poult survival and how that impacts turkey abundance and distribution. There's been some recent some bubblings underneath the surface, if you will. There's been some Conservation Congress questions, some spring hearing questions that have come up regarding the timing of our spring harvest season. There's some folks that think maybe the season goes too late. The one concern I have is if we start the season too early. So as of right now, we start the season the 3rd Wednesday of April. And the reason that we do that is because that gives the birds, especially these dominant gobblers, a chance to mate and breed with hens. So my fear is if we take those birds off the landscape too early, how does that impact our population? So that's one thing that's sort of bubbling under the surface. And another thing that I'd like to do here fairly soon is, we have this range map that I'm pretty sure that we can update here, given what we know now with how turkeys are distributed. So I think this is more appropriate probably than ever. Folks think that research is a one-way street, and I can tell you it is not. It goes up and down and left and right and front and back, and we take 3 steps back in order to go 4 step forward and so on. So I certainly I have an idea of what we're going to be doing in the near future, but Lord only knows, 5 years from now, what's going to be on the horizon as far as research is concerned. So, but again, I do want to sort of come back to this one last time. I really do feel like we've done a lot of really good research that informs management, and people around the country are taking notice. Even, the Wildlife Society, when we had the conference here in Wisconsin a few years ago, we had this feature article in the Wildlife Professional. And people know that turkeys are really abundant, and they are truly thriving in Wisconsin. And we feel that we've been able to blend science and social science and ecology and just game management in order to sustain a really good hardy population here. So. Of course, with that, as everybody knows, research and management, there's a whole bunch of folks behind the scenes that help out. And, we could sit here for a long time and recognize folks. And I'm truly blessed to work with a lot of great people and organizations and so on that have helped with all the work. And on the very bottom there, I'm more than happy to have a conversation. If there's questions that folks have, feel free to reach out to me, and I'm happy to answer any questions that may come up. So with that, I thank you again for having me. I hope that you learned a little bit of something, had a little bit of fun, and with that, thank you.
Susan, right. You want to handle the questions?
All right, I was waiting for you. So at this point, that was Eric Anderson who was sharing his screen. You can go ahead and select your screen that you would like. Speaker view or gallery view is at this point is helpful. Most of you, if not all of you, are on mute. So there's 2 ways to ask questions. You can unmute yourself, or you can put your questions in the chat box. Chris is here. Hello, Chris. Why don't you give a good wave there? Yep. So thank you so much. That was really interesting and really, really great. I actually have a question since I don't see anything in the chat. So I'm going to take liberty and ask my question. Yeah. How do you think climate change might affect, if it will, populations of turkey?
That's a good question. That's actually something that hasn't, I'm just sort of rambling through my mind here right now, and I can't even think of anybody that's directly working on climate change issues for turkeys. I think it certainly can. If we have changes in just the composition on the landscape, that at the very least is certainly going to move birds around on the landscape. It doesn't necessarily mean that we won't still have birds here. Turkeys are truly a generalist, and they will, you'll find them in parking lots, and you'll find them in forested areas. So I don't necessarily think that it'll decrease our population. I just think it'll more so than anything else, it'll probably shift the distribution of birds within Wisconsin. So good question though.
Okay. Anyone else have a question they'd like to ask?
Oh, I certainly would. I can't go without asking a question. Chris, I'm gonna throw a curveball at you because this is about natural history of turkeys, and perhaps you can answer it, perhaps not. If you look at the number of bird species that have naked heads, it's pretty limited. And the interesting thing about turkeys is both sexes have them, although the male is much more feather free on their head than the female is. Right. Can you speculate, or can you tell us why it is they think that turkey heads are featherless?
Well, I don't know why. Well, what I can say is that when they're in their mating season, turkey, especially the male turkeys, they will get all sorts of different colors within their skin, and so a number of different pigments. But you'll see reds, really bright reds, and blues and whites, which is one of the reasons why nowadays when you go through Hunter's Ed, they will specifically tell you when you go out turkey hunting to not wear red, white, and blue, because that is one of the things that turkey hunters will look for when they're out hunting turkeys. So, that those colorations are used as a sign, not only to females when they're trying to attract females, but also to other gobblers. So male turkeys have this hierarchy, and there is definitely a dominance, this hierarchy ladder that they have. And so they are, trying to sort of signal to other birds, hey, I'm the guy here, and so on. So that's what they use it for. How that actually came about, I don't know. That's a good question. I got frozen again too. So hey, the one reason why this is off topic, and it looks like it happens again here. So if you didn't know, apparently I also have this ventriloquist thing on the side here, so it looks like my picture is frozen again. So we're going to try to unfreeze that and let's see what's going on here. But anyhow, see if that works. There we go. All right.
I had a question.
Yeah.
You mentioned that mammals are the main predators on the poults and all of the different stages in the life cycle. But I wondered if you could be more specific. What types of mammals do the most predation on turkeys at all various stages in their life cycle?
Yeah, so for the nesting period, so the nest predators we generally think of as raccoons and possums, sometimes fox or coyote. And there's certain cues that you can look for with nest predators, particularly how they actually destroy the nest. So like skunks and possums will actually, they'll take an egg and sort of break it apart. So that there's still like maybe half the egg is still whole. Raccoons, on the other hand, will literally just smash everything. So that's one of the ways that we try to differentiate between the nest predators. As far as predation on the adults, that is coyotes. Coyotes are one of the main ones. We also get great horned owls that will take birds. They'll take hens off of nest. There's also reports of them actually taking turkeys out of the roost in trees. So those are predominantly the main predators that we think of for turkeys.
Chris, we have a question in the chat. Is the DNR or other researchers studying urban turkeys? Bruce Wendt had indicated that they have a flock of upwards of 30 in their neighborhood throughout the year.
Yeah, so I don't know of any specific research that's going on with urban turkeys, but I hear reports all the time. we'll get, every once in a while, we'll get a phone call on nuisance turkeys in Milwaukee or, various other urban areas. And I know here in Madison, there's actually a Facebook page for a flock of turkeys that's in downtown Madison. They have this little cult following, if you will. So, the short answer to your question is I'm not directly aware of any studies right now that are going on urban turkeys, but that's I'm sure that's something that could potentially be addressed down the road.
I have a question going back to that whole there's no feathers on the turkeys' heads. How do they even survive winter, really? I mean, there must be some type of biological ability for that circulation or something to protect their heads from, they have no feathers.
Right. Yeah. I don't know. But I'm assuming that there's, they probably, perhaps increased blood flow, or I do know, like in some birds and in turkeys, actually for their legs, because there's another part of the body that has absolutely no feathers. So they have within the blood vessels in their legs, they actually have a shunt that's there, and they can regulate the flow of blood that's going into the legs. So on those really, really cold days, that way there won't be so much blood that's going into the feet, and then there won't be so much heat loss. So.
I find that pretty amazing to me. Any other questions from the group? Turkeys are found everywhere, pretty much in North America. Is that correct? Maybe even Mexico. Their distribution is.
Yep. So all 48 states. We even have turkeys in Hawaii that were obviously brought in. I think the only state would be Alaska that we don't have at least an established population, and then there's a handful of birds in Mexico as well. So,
hey Chris, I have one more speculation question for you. Have you guys looked at all kind of at the mesopredator release thing in terms of if the big predators are raccoons and coyotes in areas where wolves are present, those numbers decline, and you would see survival rates of the females anyway going up. Is there any work that's been done with that?
Nothing that comes to mind, but that is one area of research or one question that I really would like to look at and get a better handle on some of these mesopredators and how and if they actually are having, or to what level of impact they are actually having on populations. I mean, we certainly have a whole bunch of raccoons that are on the landscape, and if these birds are nesting in corridors, I mean, that's an easy track for a predator to walk down and stumble upon a turkey. Could there actually be any potential impacts from that? I don't know what the answer is to that, but that is certainly something that I've had in the back of my mind anyway. So.
Excellent.
So you have one observer. Craig Zelkowski is just back from living in Alaska, and he has seen a turkey on the side of the road in Indian Alaska. So there you go. You've got your observer up there.
So all
I don't know if it's broad, populations of them, but
Right.
There you go.
Oh, that's cool.
Yeah.
Tremendous. Well, Chris, we'd like to thank you one more time for doing the presentation, getting online, being part of this question and answer time period. So greatly appreciated.
Yes, of course. And like I said, at the end of the talk there, I'm more than happy if folks would like to reach out. Feel free to provide folks my email, and I'm more than happy if you have a real specific question or something that is sort of irking you. I always love sitting down and having a conversation, especially face to face, if and when we can ever do that again. Yeah. So.
Yeah, you're getting a lot of applause here in the chat I see, and thank you so much, Chris. Our next program, we do not have a program in December. Just as a reminder to everyone, it is Christmas bird count. It is limited this year to those that have participated in the past, but if you're dying to get involved with Christmas bird count, do get a hold of us, and we'll get you in touch with the coordinators for either the Amherst area or the Stevens Point area. In January, we will be back with our program, and remind me, board members, I believe it's Karen Dostal taking us into the sea. She has an amazing footage of coral reefs. We're going to stray a little bit from birds for that month to take us into a little ocean adventure. So stay tuned for that. She's got some incredible, she's going to blow, some footage from there. So we're excited about that. Thank you all very much. Have a wonderful Turkey Day. And all of you stay well, stay safe, and we'll see you in the new year.
Excellent.
Very much.
Thanks again.